Bron Breakker just committed the most cowardly and disgusting act in WWE history by spearing Paul Heyman, a 59-year-old non-wrestler, and splitting him in half like an animal. What we witnessed wasn't just shocking television, it was a brutal assault on wrestling's greatest mind by someone who has no respect for legends, no understanding of boundaries, and no business putting his hands on someone who has given everything to this industry. And if you think attacking a defenseless advocate who can't fight back represents toughness or intensity, you're either completely delusional or you don't understand that we just watched the line between wrestling and criminal assault get obliterated. But here's the question that should make every wrestling fan absolutely furious: how can WWE allow someone as reckless and dangerous as Bron Breakker to physically assault a non-competitor like Paul Heyman without immediately firing him and pressing criminal charges for what was clearly a premeditated attack on someone who has never claimed to be a wrestler? Because what Bron did wasn't wrestling, it was assault and battery that should result in criminal prosecution and permanent banishment from professional wrestling. Hashtag the setup that exposed Bron's cowardice. Let me break down the most disgusting attack in wrestling history, because what led to Bron Breakker's brutal assault on Paul Heyman wasn't the result of competitive fire or storyline intensity, it was premeditated violence against someone who had no ability to defend himself and no reason to expect a physical attack. Paul Heyman was standing at ringside doing what he does best, providing strategic counsel and promotional excellence for his clients, when Bron Breakker decided to target the one person in WWE who represents intelligence, creativity, and the business acumen that has made professional wrestling culturally significant. Paul wasn't dressed for competition, wasn't prepared for physical confrontation, and most importantly, has never presented himself as someone capable of defending against a legitimate athletic assault from someone with Bron's size and training advantages. The cowardice of targeting someone in their late 50s who can't possibly defend themselves against a genetic freak athlete in his prime proves that Bron Breakker is nothing more than a bully who picks on people weaker than himself rather than competing against actual wrestlers. This wasn't spontaneous intensity or competitive fire getting out of hand, this was calculated targeting of the most vulnerable person at ringside by someone who knew there would be no physical consequences for his actions. Hashtag the spear that should end Bron's career. The moment Bron Breakker's spear connected with Paul Heyman's unprotected body was the most sickening moment in modern wrestling, because everyone watching understood they were witnessing genuine assault rather than controlled wrestling violence. The sound when Bron's shoulder drove into Paul's ribcage wasn't the typical wrestling impact designed to look devastating while minimizing actual damage, it was bone-crushing contact that immediately raised concerns about serious internal injuries to someone whose body isn't conditioned for that kind of trauma. Paul's immediate collapse wasn't wrestling selling or dramatic performance, it was the genuine physical response of someone whose body had just absorbed impact that it was never designed or prepared to handle without serious medical consequences. The brutality of watching a 300-pound athlete at the peak of physical condition deliver his most devastating move to someone nearly 60 years old who weighs maybe 230 pounds and has no athletic training or physical preparation was absolutely nauseating to anyone with basic human decency. Medical personnel's immediate response and genuine concern proved that this wasn't controlled wrestling entertainment but a legitimate medical emergency created by someone who had no business putting his hands on a non-wrestler. Hashtag the immediate aftermath that proved this was wrong. The immediate aftermath of Bron's assault on Paul Heyman was chaos as everyone present recognized that something fundamentally wrong had just occurred that went far beyond typical wrestling boundaries into territory that felt genuinely criminal. Security personnel were visibly uncertain about how to respond because this clearly wasn't typical wrestling violence between competitors but appeared to be genuine assault on someone who had no ability to defend themselves or retaliate appropriately. WWE officials rushed to check on Paul's condition with obvious genuine concern rather than typical wrestling production focus, proving that even people accustomed to wrestling violence recognized this situation as different and potentially dangerous. The crowd's reaction wasn't excitement or heat, it was uncomfortable silence mixed with genuine concern for Paul's welfare, proving that audiences instinctively understood they had witnessed something that crossed acceptable entertainment boundaries. Most tellingly, other wrestlers at ringside showed visible shock and disapproval rather than typical wrestling reactions, proving that even people within the industry recognized Bron had crossed lines that shouldn't be crossed regardless of storyline justification. Hashtag the historical context that makes this unforgivable. To understand just how disgusting Bron Breakker's attack on Paul Heyman truly is, you need to understand Paul's historical significance and the unwritten rules about protecting non-wrestlers that Bron completely violated. Paul Heyman has spent over 30 years contributing to professional wrestling's artistic development, business success, and cultural significance through his creative genius, promotional brilliance, and strategic vision that has elevated countless wrestlers and storylines. He has never presented himself as a physical competitor capable of defending against athletic assault, always positioning himself as the advocate and manager whose value comes from intellectual rather than physical contributions to wrestling entertainment. The wrestling industry has always maintained unwritten rules about protecting managers, announcers, and other non-competitors from the kind of physical violence that active wrestlers subject each other to during normal competition. Bron's violation of these fundamental industry norms proves that he has no respect for wrestling tradition, no understanding of appropriate boundaries, and no business being trusted with the responsibility that comes with being a professional wrestler. Hashtag the legal implications that WWE is ignoring from a legal perspective. Bron Breakker's assault on Paul Heyman raises serious questions about criminal liability, civil damages, and WWE's corporate responsibility for allowing this attack to occur without adequate prevention or immediate consequences. In any other workplace environment, physically assaulting a coworker who isn't engaged in similar physical activities would result in immediate termination, criminal charges, and substantial civil liability for both the attacker and the employer who failed to prevent it. Employment law experts would likely view this situation as creating hostile work environment liability for WWE, potential assault and battery charges for Bron, and civil damages for Paul related to physical injuries, emotional distress, and medical expenses. The fact that this occurred on live television with millions of witnesses creates additional complications regarding WWE's duty to maintain safe working conditions for all employees regardless of their job functions or physical capabilities. WWE's apparent willingness to allow this attack without immediate disciplinary action suggests either complete disregard for employee safety or acknowledgement that they scripted and approved an assault on a non-wrestler for entertainment purposes. Hashtag the physical damage that could be permanent. The physical impact of absorbing a full-force spear from someone of Bron Breakker's size and athletic ability could cause serious and potentially permanent injuries to someone of Paul Heyman's age and physical condition. Rib fractures, internal organ damage, spinal compression injuries, and soft tissue trauma are all realistic possibilities when someone without athletic conditioning absorbs that level of impact from a trained athlete executing a devastating finishing move. At 59 years old, Paul's body doesn't recover from physical trauma the way younger athletes' bodies do, meaning that injuries sustained from this attack could have lasting effects on his health, mobility, and quality of life. The recklessness of delivering such a devastating move to someone whose body isn't conditioned for that kind of punishment proves that Bron either doesn't understand the potential consequences of his actions or simply doesn't care about the harm he might cause. Medical professionals viewing this attack would likely express serious concerns about the appropriateness of subjecting non-athletes to this level of physical violence regardless of entertainment value or storyline justification. Hashtag the moral failure that everyone should condemn beyond legal and physical considerations. Bron Breakker's assault on Paul Heyman represents a moral failure that every decent human being should condemn regardless of their feelings about wrestling entertainment or storyline development. Physically attacking someone significantly older, smaller, and less physically capable than yourself is in toughness or intensity. It's bullying that demonstrates fundamental character flaws and lack of basic human decency. The power imbalance between a prime athletic specimen and a nearly 60-year-old non-athlete makes this attack morally indefensible regardless of any storyline justification WWE might attempt to provide. Paul Heyman's decades of contributions to wrestling and his status as a respected industry legend should have earned him protection from this kind of physical assault by younger wrestlers who owe their opportunities to people like him. The moral bankruptcy of targeting someone who can't defend themselves proves that Bron Breakker values shock value and personal advancement over basic respect for legends and fundamental human decency. Hashtag the industry reaction that proves this was wrong. According to multiple wrestling industry sources, the reaction throughout professional wrestling to Bron's assault on Paul has been overwhelmingly negative, with veterans and current performers expressing shock and disapproval at the violation of fundamental industry standards. Multiple wrestling legends have reportedly expressed private concerns about this attack setting dangerous precedents for how non-wrestlers are treated and whether managers and advocates can continue performing their roles without fear of physical assault. Current wrestlers are allegedly questioning whether WWE's apparent approval of this attack means they should be concerned about their own safety when working in storylines that might involve similar physical violence against non-competitors. Wrestling trainers and industry veterans have been discussing whether this incident requires the industry to establish clearer boundaries about appropriate physical contact with non-wrestlers to prevent future incidents. The universal industry recognition that Bron crossed fundamental lines proves that this wasn't just controversial entertainment but a genuine violation of wrestling's unwritten rules about protecting people who aren't trained for physical competition. Hashtag the precedent that terrifies everyone. Perhaps the most dangerous aspect of Bron Breakker's assault on Paul Heyman is the precedent it establishes for future attacks on managers, announcers, referees, and other non-wrestlers who perform essential functions without athletic training or physical preparation. If WWE allows this attack without serious consequences, it sends a message that non-competitors are legitimate targets for physical violence from athletes whose training and capabilities create dangerous power imbalances. Managers and advocates throughout wrestling are reportedly concerned about their own safety if the industry accepts that they can be subjected to devastating finishing moves typically reserved for trained wrestlers who understand how to protect themselves. The chilling effect on non-wrestlers' willingness to perform their roles could be devastating for wrestling entertainment if people become afraid to work as managers or advocates due to concerns about physical assault. WWE's response to this situation will likely determine whether similar attacks become acceptable or whether the industry maintains traditional protections for non-competitors who contribute to wrestling without claiming athletic capabilities. Hashtag the fan betrayal that cannot be forgiven. Wrestling fans who have invested decades of emotional energy in Paul Heyman's contributions to the industry were betrayed by watching him become the victim of physical assault for entertainment purposes that served no meaningful storyline objective. Fans who respect Paul's legendary status and appreciate his intellectual contributions to wrestling were forced to watch him be physically destroyed by someone whose entire career has been built on advantages Paul helped create through his promotional genius. The disrespect shown to one of wrestling's most important non-wrestling figures sends terrible messages to fans about how the industry values the people who have made wrestling culturally significant through contributions beyond physical competition. Long-term wrestling fans understand that Paul Heyman represents everything important about wrestling's creative and business development, making his physical assault particularly offensive to people who appreciate wrestling's artistic and strategic elements. The betrayal of fan trust in WWE's judgment and basic human decency could have lasting effects on audience willingness to invest emotionally in storylines that might involve similar violations of fundamental boundaries. #the Bloodline implications that complicate everything. The fact that Paul Heyman serves as special counsel to Roman Reigns and the Bloodline creates additional layers of significance to Bron's attack that could have major implications for ongoing WWE storylines and power dynamics. Attacking the Bloodline's most trusted advisor and strategic mind represents an act of war that demands response from Roman Reigns and the entire Anoa'i family structure that has dominated WWE programming for years. The disrespect shown to the Bloodline through this assault on their counsel could trigger retaliation that escalates into one of WWE's most significant feuds, assuming Paul survives the physical trauma without career-ending injuries. Roman Reigns' response to watching his most trusted advisor get brutally attacked will likely define his character and leadership capabilities while establishing boundaries about what attacks on Bloodline associates will and won't be tolerated. The Bloodline's legendary commitment to family and associates suggests that Bron just made himself a target for systematic revenge from wrestling's most dominant faction, assuming WWE allows appropriate storyline consequences. The Bron Breakker character destruction through his cowardly assault on Paul Heyman. Bron Breakker has permanently destroyed any possibility of audiences viewing him as anything more than a bully who picks on people weaker than himself rather than competing against actual wrestlers. His willingness to attack a defenseless non-wrestler eliminates any sympathy or support he might have built with audiences who value authentic toughness and legitimate competitive achievement over bullying behavior. The character damage is irreversible because audiences will never forget that Bron demonstrated his toughness by physically destroying someone who had no ability to defend themselves or retaliate appropriately. Real toughness involves competing against equals or stronger opponents, not targeting vulnerable non-competitors whose only crime was being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Bron's reputation among wrestling fans who value authentic intensity over cowardly bullying has been permanently damaged by his decision to target someone who represents everything intellectual and strategic about wrestling excellence. The missed opportunity for real storytelling. What makes Bron's assault on Paul even more frustrating is understanding the missed opportunity for creating genuinely compelling storylines that didn't require violating fundamental boundaries about protecting non-wrestlers. Bron could have challenged Paul's clients directly, creating legitimate athletic competition against wrestlers who are prepared for physical violence rather than targeting the advisor who isn't trained for that kind of conflict. The intellectual warfare between Bron and Paul could have created months of compelling television based on strategic maneuvering and psychological competition rather than physical assault on someone defenseless. Character development showing Bron learning to appreciate Paul's contributions rather than simply destroying him would have created more meaningful storytelling that elevated both performers. WWE's creative team wasted the opportunity for authentic storytelling in favor of shock value that violated industry norms and potentially caused genuine physical harm to a beloved non-wrestler. The corporate responsibility. WWE abandoned. WWE's corporate leadership has fundamental responsibility to protect all employees from workplace violence regardless of entertainment value or storyline justification, responsibility they completely abandoned by allowing Bron's assault on Paul. Professional entertainment companies have legal and ethical obligations to maintain safe working environments for all personnel regardless of their job functions or physical capabilities. The decision to allow or script this attack represents complete abandonment of corporate duty to protect employees who aren't trained or prepared for physical violence from athletic colleagues. WWE's apparent prioritization of shock value over employee safety creates liability exposure and damages their reputation as a responsible corporate employer in the entertainment industry. The precedent that entertainment value justifies workplace violence against non-athletic personnel could affect WWE's ability to recruit and retain talented people in non-wrestling roles if they conclude the company won't protect them. The solution that could still save this despite the serious damage already done. There are still possibilities for WWE to address this situation appropriately and establish that attacking non-wrestlers will not be tolerated regardless of storyline considerations. Immediate suspension of Bron Breakker pending investigation would demonstrate that WWE takes employee safety seriously and that physical assault on non-competitors has serious consequences. Public acknowledgement that the attack crossed unacceptable boundaries would help re-establish industry norms about protecting people who aren't trained for physical competition. Substantial storyline consequences showing that Bron's cowardly attack damages his career rather than advancing it would send appropriate messages about what behavior is acceptable in professional wrestling. Implementation of clearer policies protecting non-wrestlers from physical violence would help prevent similar incidents while demonstrating WWE's commitment to maintaining safe working conditions for all employees. ## The long-term industry implications. The long-term implications of Bron's attack on Paul extend throughout professional wrestling into fundamental questions about how non-wrestlers should be treated and what boundaries exist regarding physical violence against people who aren't trained competitors. Other wrestling promotions will likely review their own policies about protecting managers, announcers, and other non-athletic personnel from physical assault by trained wrestlers. The industry may need to establish clearer standards about appropriate physical contact with non-wrestlers to prevent similar incidents and protect people whose contributions don't involve athletic competition. Insurance companies and regulatory bodies might develop new requirements for protecting non-athletic personnel in wrestling environments to ensure workplace safety standards are maintained. The precedent established by WWE's handling of this situation will influence how the entire wrestling industry approaches protection of non-wrestlers and establishment of appropriate boundaries for physical violence. ## Conclusion. The attack that crossed every line. Bron Breakker's brutal spear attack on Paul Heyman represents the most cowardly and indefensible assault in wrestling history, proving that some lines should never be crossed regardless of entertainment value or storyline justification. The attack violated fundamental industry norms about protecting non-wrestlers, demonstrated complete lack of respect for legends who built the industry, and potentially caused serious physical harm to someone who had no ability to defend themselves. Paul Heyman's decades of contributions to wrestling should have earned him protection from this kind of physical assault by younger wrestlers who owe their opportunities to the industry that people like him helped build. The precedent that this attack establishes for future treatment of managers, advocates, and other non-wrestlers could have devastating effects on wrestling entertainment if people become afraid to perform these essential roles. Most importantly, Bron's assault proves that some wrestlers value shock value and personal advancement over basic human decency, respect for legends, and fundamental understanding of appropriate boundaries in professional wrestling. Are you as disgusted as every wrestling fan should be? Do you understand that attacking a 59-year-old non-wrestler represents cowardice rather than toughness? Can you see how this assault violated every fundamental rule about protecting people who aren't trained for physical competition? Explode with outrage in the comments and tell us whether you think Bron Breakker should be immediately fired and charged with assault for his brutal attack on a defenseless legend. Should WWE protect non-wrestlers from physical violence, or is everything acceptable for entertainment purposes? Destroy that like button if you're furious about Bron's cowardly assault on Paul Heyman and believe he should face serious consequences for crossing fundamental lines. Subscribe to WrestlingNewsCC for continued coverage of this developing situation and its implications, and share this video with everyone who needs to understand that some lines should never be crossed in professional wrestling. Bron Breakker has proven himself to be a coward who attacks defenseless legends, and WWE's response will determine whether the industry maintains any standards for protecting non-wrestlers from physical assault.